This is Josh Spicer from GameWisdom.com. I hope you enjoyed this Critical Thought, your daily discussion on game design. We got a great critical thought for you today. This is one that was suggested a few weeks ago by Gwald. I think I pronounced that right, hopefully. And this is the one that I was talking about was going to probably get me in trouble, or the first time to get into trouble for 2017. And that is the ever popular topic of what does it mean to be indie these days, specifically for game development. Now, this is based on today's post, which should be going up somewhere here. If not, it should be in the notes below. Unless you're watching this from the post or any of the cross-posting, and if you are, hello. Now, when it comes to being an indie developer, we've talked about the rise of the indie scene over the last 8 years or so. Actually, it should be about 9 years now, as we're now in 2017. But when we talk about being indie, it has certainly become a very loose term to describe game development. On one end of the scale, you have your first-time developers, people who are either enthusiasts or students, just starting to get in the industry. We have established companies like Clay Entertainment, Arkin Games, the Chinese Room, I think that's what it's called, from Gone Home, and everyone in between. There's also affects what it means to actually make an indie game as well. Again, we have developers who make their own custom engine, those who use Unity, Game Maker, RPG Maker, and what platform you're on, what your genre is. I mean, it has become a very wide and very loose term. And because of that, it becomes very hard to distinguish. This is a similar issue we talked about when it comes to Kickstarted and crowdfunding based titles, and how you can have two games with similar budgets or similar things they're asking for on Kickstarter and have a very wide difference in terms of what their game is being, or what their game that they're trying to make. And this can lead to confusion of the market. In the that example of, if you see one game that's they're asking 400,000 and another one who's asking 800,000, you'll have consumers saying, your game should be 2 times better than this one, and stuff like that. But when it comes to the independent scene, it is a very muddled market, and it's becoming more and more cluttered by the day, as we have certainly seen with the rise of Greenlight, the iOS store, dozens, if not hundreds, of games being released daily these days. And then, of course, there's the discussion about quality. Someone brought up the topic about dollar games, 99-cent titles on Steam. Again, the numerous very cheap, very quickly made games released on iOS, etc. But when it comes to the independent, or to the title of indie developer, this is where things can get a little bit more challenging to decide. From the post, I talked about the fact that these days you have a lot of people under that title of being an indie developer. Now, traditionally, as we talked about, when we look at game studios, they're usually categorized by first, second, or third party. First party, again, being the console maker themselves, Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo. Second party would be studios that are either owned or partially owned, or will usually just stick to one console. Stuff like divisions like Sony Santa Monica, Naughty Dog, HAL Laboratories, Microsoft Game Studios, stuff like that. And then third party, of course, being everyone else. Your Firaxis's, Eidos, Square Enix, and again, so many different examples. And that's how things worked for a good almost 2.5 decades. When the indie scene moment, when it really started to flourish about 9 years ago, this is when we started to see games being made outside of studios. Your one-man, two-man groups. Studios being formed from people literally networking across, states or even across countries and continents. And this is where we saw these games being released that, again, didn't have the perfect polish, but were very unique in their designs. And that kind of uniqueness has really led to the indie market growing to what it is today. You're not going to see games like Gone Home, Darkest Dungeon, Firewatch, and etc. coming from a AAA studio with, millions of dollars in terms of budgets and operating costs. And because of that, we have certainly seen things grown. As we saw very recently with the 2016 Game Awards, numerous indie titles won awards there. And it's no longer considered, a derogatory term, or you're going to look down on someone for being an indie developer. I mean, the last 2 years in a row, my top games were from indie studios, Renowned Explorers and Darkest Dungeon for 2016. And big publishers and the mainstream market are really keeping an eye on things these days. As we mentioned, I think, last week on our wrap-up show, we talked about how Darkest Dungeon is now on PSN. Claire Entertainment was also put on there. And of course, we have many indie games, or the big name ones, becoming major sensations in the mainstream. Minecraft is probably one of the best examples of that. You have, toys, books. I think there's like food now for Minecraft. There's, the Telltale Adventure game based in Minecraft, and it's really not showing any signs of dying out. And of course, the other big name example would be Five Nights at Freddy's, who my mind is still can't process the fact that there's not only a Five Nights at Freddy's game, but there's a movie being in the works. There's a toy line. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was getting my allergy shot today, and a child or someone drew a Five Nights at Freddy's sketch that was hung up on their wall. This is up there with me seeing, Pokemon Go offers at my local, like at a pizza place that just shocked me for a second. But the point and what is kind of driving this discussion about indie developers is that people like Red Hook Games, Introversion, Scott from Five Nights at Freddy's, and even something like Stardew Valley, they're not really at the same low level as what we consider other indie developers anymore. And this raises the question I want to ask you. Is there a point when you can't be considered an indie developer anymore, regardless of what your quote-unquote company is or what your operating costs are? And that's the kind of issue that I was talking about. Again, with something like Five Nights at Freddy's, even though that was done on a very modest budget, is it really fair to put a game that has achieved that success in the same breath as something like Renowned Explorers, Dwarf Fortress, and any number of other indie titles? And as we talked about before, for every indie game I bring up, there's probably 2 or 3 dozen more that I'm forgetting or have never even heard of. But the problem, though, when we talk about studios like Red Hook Games, like Sky, like Toby Fox with Undertale, Stardew Valley, the problem when we try to group them in with indies is that they have achieved a level of success that these other studios have certainly dreamed of, and has also afforded them something else: clout. Like I said in my post, the millisecond that Scott announces another game, whether it's a Five Nights at Freddy's sequel or something completely original, every gaming site is going to post that press release. Same thing with the next game from Toby Fox. Firewatch, for instance. When Campo Santo, I apologize if I just messed up your name there. If they announce their next game, everyone's going to mention it. And again, this kind of clout is something that all the indie developers are dreaming of. We've talked about this before with the difficulty of discoverability. Even if you make an amazing game, if you don't do the right kind of marketing or press releases to get your game noticed, it's going to come and go on within minutes. And sometimes you need the help of, a famous YouTuber. Five Nights at Freddy's was picked up by like Markiplier and PewDiePie. And I know Renowned Explorers got a mention from Total Biscuit, which elevated that game. But again, for every one of these games that manages to do that, who knows how many are barely making a dent, or even breaking even to begin with. Now, with that said, of course, it's important to point out the fact that there are developers, especially in the market, who have succeeded for a long time without becoming, major names. Spiderweb Software, for instance, has certainly established a niche for themselves with classic PC or CRPG design. Someone linked to a Gamasutra speech by a developer who's been doing it for at least 10 years. And this is the other part of this. it almost seems like there's different tiers of indie development these days. You have, like, at your lowest tier be first timers, the guys who maybe haven't released a game, they may have worked on stuff or have mostly portfolio projects. Then you have the guys who are like a little bit more established, who may have made a few games, they're not well known, stuff like that. Then you have people like Spireweb Software, Arkin Games, developers who may not be household names, but they have established themselves and are able to keep going with their respective fan bases. And then, right here is kind of like that line, that breakout line of going from being just another indie developer to being something like the Chinese Room, like Red Hook Games, Introversion. Introversion being another very important example, because for the longest time, they barely made a blip in terms of the overall game scene. They've, of course, had some really great games like Darwinia, Defcom, Uplink, but again, in terms of those successes compared to Prison Architect, it's night and day. And again, when we talk about that kind of breakout point, when developers transition over to becoming big names, that brings us back to that question. Do we still consider themselves indie developers anymore? I'm not quite sure of that myself. In my post, I kind of said no. I can't see something like Scott again from Five Nights at Freddy's, I keep forgetting his last name and I apologize, being considered indie anymore. When you have an entire toy line and movie coming out about your game, even if you are still a one or two man studio, things are certainly different now. And the same goes again for something like any of the Game of the Year winners: Stardew Valley, Her Story, Dear Esther, Firewatch, and again, we can keep going on. But the other part of this question is, what do we describe these developers as now? Do we consider themselves as third-party developers? Again, it's very debatable, because when we say third-party developer, we are talking about an established company. Again, IDOS, Blue Byte, you name it. And when you become a third-party developer, again, people have different expectations for you. When you're an indie developer, if your game has a few bugs in it or it's not 100% refined, people are willing to overlook that by the sheer uniqueness. But if the same thing came from a company like Square Enix or Nintendo or Sony, people are going to be a lot harder on you. And that's why it's very tricky to say if we should consider those indie developers who have made it as now third-party developers. Again, for those of you watching, what do you think about this? What kind of sense can you make out of it? Because it is very hard to talk about this. As we said before, the game industry moves at such a fast pace that it's very hard to kind of stop and take stock of what's going on. I mean, we're still having that whole gamer debate, or I know some people are. It's kind of hard to tell, again, because of how fast things move. But let's wrap things up here for today. I'm sorry I didn't have a prompt. I just didn't know what would be like a good prompt to say indie game. Maybe that Indie Game the movie. I mean, I could put up like a little poster of that or something. But to summarize, the indie market is no longer this little thing, operating on the fringe of the game industry. It has become a big business, and major publishers and console makers, and even the mainstream market in some cases, is certainly taking notice. Again, when you have big name YouTubers like PewDiePie, Markiplier, Tobiscuit, and so on, when they bring up these games, it really helps elevate them. And as we talked about before, once you have that big hit, it really grants you a lot of perks and bonuses that your other indie developer certainly will not have. Again, these games that have made it big, your Stardew Valleys, Undertales, etc., that allows them to sort of carry and leverage that success on for future games. I don't know if you hear my fire alarm, but I am going to quickly get up and close my door. Almost got through the whole thing, right? But, as we were saying, once you have hit that level of success, those advantages really put you into an almost another tier compared to, again, your first or second time indie developers, your 3 or 4 man group that is just starting out. And it kind of raises that, again, the question is, what is an indie developer these days? Someone, I read a comment, suggested that you could describe an indie developer as someone who self-publishes. Again, that's still too wide, too general of a term. Because again, when you have a game like Five Nights at Freddy's, he certainly doesn't need any polishing anymore to get the word out about the next Five Nights at Freddy's or sister location. Same thing goes again for Firewatch, for Darkest Dungeon, etc. Now, I don't know if you can still hear the fire alarm, but I'll end things quickly here. But again, this is not something that's going to be answered in a day. And again, for those of you watching, let me know what you think below. And as always, thank you so much for watching and enjoying these videos. For you first-timers, be sure to like and subscribe if you're enjoying things. If you have a suggestion for a future critical thought, hopefully one that won't get me yelled at by too many people, be sure to leave it below. Otherwise, I am Josh Beiser from GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. Since the Top 10 2016 list is now over, be sure to check back daily for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, hopefully with less controversial posts. But until then, have a great night, and see you all tomorrow. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBeiser for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GW Beiser for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.